Joining me now to explore this issue is Mantedieng Mamabolo, who's an author. She joins me in studio, and also we have, to unpack this particular issue, we have clinical psychologist Lobone Raditladi. Guys, thank you so much for making time to join us on Morning News today. Let me start with you, Mantedieng, about this particular issue. And you speak about this in your book, Pupils Family Tree. This is slightly different, though. But when do you think is the right age to actually start having that conversation with your child?
Good morning to you and your viewers. I think any conversation needs to start as soon as possible. In terms of, so my book is more introducing the kind of same-sex relationships into the mindsets of young children, because these things are present in the worlds that they exist in. So in terms of talking sex, I would imagine using age-appropriate language, just explaining to children to be aware of their body parts, and naming them with the names that they have, like instead of nicknames and whatnot, just using the correct terminology to refer to those body parts, and just making them aware. And as they get older, obviously you would introduce more details, but just always being age appropriate and having the conversation.
And that's true, isn't it? Because Lobone, when we look at kids, and as parents, we tend to want to come up with strange nicknames for body parts. How does this affect the child, though, when you do that?
Well, firstly, what happens is that the child will not be comfortable with those parts, and it will definitely affect their future in terms of how they will be able to communicate. So naming these parts sets a foundation for the children to be able to communicate with their parents later on, should anything go wrong.
Well, what age group do you think we should start at, and what do we introduce to the kids at that particular age group that you think it's good for us to start having that conversation with kids?
Well, as children grow up, they go through certain stages of psychosocial development, and each stage requires that a child acquires certain skills and knowledge, and this knowledge includes and is not limited to sexual education, right? Sexual education, which we are talking about today. And we need to consider that now it is important that when sex education is taught to children, it must be developmentally appropriate, it must be sequential, and it must be honest, right? So if these three aspects are taken into consideration, it sets a foundation, and it makes sure that children are not unnecessarily exposed to inappropriate sexual content, which may be too overwhelming for them, and then they don't know what to do with it.
Mante, it's so true that as parents, this is our responsibility. We're afraid of it, but it is our responsibility as well, because if the kids don't learn from us, they might get that information the wrong way from somewhere else.
Absolutely. And I think the one thing that we need to understand about children, and from my research, I've come to find that children are very observant. Children don't necessarily do what you say, but they tend to mimic what they see and what they observe, and also just your reactions to certain things. They pick up on that, and they take your cues based on your reactions and how society reacts to you. So I think it's just we just need to be very observant, as well as adults and parents, to and cognizant of what we do around children.
Yeah, very true. As a clinical psychologist, Lobone, when you look at parents trying to explain, I mean, I look at myself, so I've got a 13-year-old, and at some point I had to start talking to my son about these type of things. Is it good for us to share our own stories with the kids? Does that make it any easier to say, listen, when I was your age, this is what happened, and so forth?
Well, it depends from parent to parent, but generally I don't think that is necessary. What I think is necessary, though, is for parents to observe what their children are doing. And, for example, children may start from the age of 3 to 6, they may already be touching their genitals, right? So parents observe this behavior, and they need to start engaging with their children by telling them what this means, and making them aware of the importance of being aware of their development, without necessarily relating to their own stories, right? This makes them to be very, very comfortable.
Okay.
Yeah.
And let's talk about, we were talking about kids, are you going to 6 years old there? I want to go to adolescence now. At which stage do we start explaining condoms and that type of thing and sexual behavior to adolescent kids?
Yeah. Remember that I've mentioned that everything should be
sequential,
developmentally appropriate and sequential. Right? So a lot would have already been done by parents and then by preschool and foundation and intermediate phase, right? So from the senior phase, say from grade 7 upwards, right? This is the right time for teachers to start talking about this stuff. Even the parents themselves, right, to start introducing issues like abstinence, to start introducing issues like reproduction, right, as they go up in the phase, grade 10, grade 11, grade 12, and so forth. But also health relationships are important at this stage because they know then how to protect themselves, how to interact with others.
Okay, I want to just bring that in about the teachers themselves. Do you think sometimes as parents we leave too much to the teachers and say, listen, I'm sending the kid to school, I'm sure at some point they're going to tell them about this, tell them about that. We're leaving it all up to the school sometimes, are we not?
Absolutely, and I think also we forget that teachers are human beings with their own belief systems, and I think if you don't introduce certain things like he was talking about abstinence, and if you look at the realities of the world and our society right now, you do have teenagers having sex, so to preach abstinence might not be the one, the only approach to it. So I think in terms of a curriculum, we do need to teach things about, start talking about consent in sexual contents and the power dynamics around sexuality and your sex. So I think, like you were saying, developmentally, you'd start teaching children about consent. Like my 2-year-old niece knows when she says no, that's no. Yeah. And then my 7-year-old nephew will reinforce once my niece says no, then he'll say, she said no, so you stop. And then once you get into adolescent ages, you'll be able to apply those same lessons into a sexual nature. But I think in terms of teachers, it takes a village to raise a child. And I think that needs to be reinforced again into our society. And
it's 2019, we also have to look at gender differences now as well. That also has to come into the conversation. And that's not an easy thing to do as well for parents, especially the older generation parents. How do they attack that? How do they go about doing that?
Exactly, like it is important then to be aware that children are different, right? Children are different just like anyone, like people are different from birth, right? So puberty is introduced in the intermediate phase. If puberty is introduced there as a sex education, right, this is where children will be able to know their differences, how their bodies changes, you know, how they are different from boys and girls, right? And if this is taught, children also need to be able to communicate with their parents that this is being taught in school, this is my textbook, this is where the parents will come in as well and reinforce that information.
It's a tough conversation to have with your kids, guys. Thank you so much for coming through and sharing your thoughts with us.